Hi, thank you. Thank you, Tim, for that fantastic introduction. I don't usually get introduced, so that's very exciting. I want to thank Dr. Spitaler and the whole search committee for inviting me to be here today, and to all of you for making time out of your very busy schedules for this opportunity to talk together. And what I want to do today is invite you to think a little bit with me about prophetic imagination and what the implications for this are in our theological classrooms. I'm going to be drawing on Charles Taylor, Walter Brueggemann, and Paulo Freire, and to try and see if a conversation amongst these three scholars can illuminate what we're trying to do as theological educators. In the end, I'm going to turn to the particular case of young women in our classrooms and what teaching with and for a prophetic imagination with them might look like. And I do think that there are many and broad applications for what I'm going to propose. And in fact, I think last week's election points out the need for a prophetic imagination in a particular way. And hopefully we can talk about that at the end. Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor offers an insightful analysis of the ways that we can understand and interact with our own cultural context when he describes what he calls the modern social imaginary. And he defines it this way, quote, "By social imaginary, I mean something broader and deeper than the intellectual schemes people may entertain when they think about social reality in a disengaged mode. I am thinking, rather, of the ways people imagine their social existence, how they fit together with others, how things go on between them and their fellows, the expectations that are normally met, and the deeper normative notions and images that underlie those expectations," end quote. So while a social imaginary might be grounded in or explained by a social theory, it's the largely unreflected upon understanding that people of a society have of the way things work. Social imaginaries, then, are the ways that societies as a whole imagine their social existence. Taylor says it this way. It is, quote, "that common understanding that makes possible common practices and a widely shared sense of legitimacy." The problem with this notion of social imaginaries is that they can hide or gloss over all kinds of evil and suffering. They can even function to normalize or naturalize injustice. We can become inured to oppression and marginalization because it seems that it has always been this way. We can fall into complacency when our social imaginaries suggest to us that the world is fine or that progress is being made. Our social imaginaries can minimize injustice, making it seem like an unfortunate but unavoidable part of the way things are. Nancy Pineda Madrid provides an example of this in her investigation of the feminicide in Juarez, Mexico. She suggests that social imaginaries participate in evil and suffering. She says, quote, "The structures that give rise to evil and thus social suffering are, in part, the product of the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and how we came to be. A consideration of these stories in light of the feminicide calls our attention to the perniciousness and insidiousness of evil, and how evil is produced by the power of seductive images and narratives that point us towards how we ought to think about human brutality," end quote. So our social imaginaries are deeply formative of the ways that we see the world, both for good and for ill. Changing them is profoundly difficult. In fact, changing them requires an additional exercise of imagination. And this is the first step towards believing that things can change. Because imagination, and particularly religious imagination, is what makes it possible for us to understand and interpret reality in light of the past, and to suggest that the world is not as it could be, there is an underlying prophetic function in imagination. The prophet draws on the rich heritage and profound paradigmatic symbols of the religious tradition to provoke the imaginations of people. The prophet uses symbolic words and actions to awaken moral concern and to spur action. In the hands of the prophet, the symbols and stories of the people are reworked so that they can provide fresh insights into the present reality. The prophet takes the tradition, makes it relatable, makes it relevant to people, and then helps them see it in new ways for the future. Walter Brueggemann, who I love, his articulation of the prophetic imagination is particularly useful in describing how an ancient vision, the critique that the prophets offered of their social context, how this can become a call for a renewed social imaginary today. For Brueggemann, the study of the prophets of the Hebrew Bible must draw the reader from an analysis of the prophet's message to their world to a continual rereading and reappropriation of the biblical message for our world. He says, quote, "The task of prophetic ministry is to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture around us." End quote. This alternative consciousness is one that is both critical of the dominant culture and energizing of the community in creating a new way of doing things. If our social imaginary is the way that we have come to understand our reality, the way things are, then the prophetic imagination is what calls us to question this social imaginary. And it's what provokes the community into a continual reshaping of the social imaginary. Brueggemann suggests that this prophetic imagination is one that continues into the contemporary world. And the most obvious examples of modern-day prophets, Martin Luther King Jr., Dorothy Day, Oscar Romero, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, these stand very much in line with the biblical prophets. They are the men and women who capture the attention of the world and draw attention in particular ways to prophetic denunciation and annunciation. They function as what biblical scholar Joseph Blenkinsop calls dissident intellectuals. They provide the profound, sustained, and persistent critique of our social imaginary, and in doing so, they provide us with a vision for how the world can be. Abraham Heschel describes this as the task of mediating the divine pathos. Prophets convey God's anger at the injustices of the way things are and God's hope for the future. But the prophetic imagination must not reside solely in the individual prophet. It can also become the social imaginary of the community. Brueggemann suggests that, quote, "Prophetic imagination begins in the ancient covenant, but is carried in concrete articulation to current issues of the day, so that the daily transactions are delineated as instances of old covenantal commitments," end quote. As a community allows itself to be shaped by the ancient witness to God's enduring love and justice, the imagination of the community, its social imaginary, can become itself prophetic. Brueggemann reminds us that, as with the ancient prophets, this is a difficult task. He says, quote, "The prophetic act, now as always, is decidedly upstream and against the grain. Its work is to take deeply rooted memories, to which we still tip our hats in vague acknowledgement, and show how those memories continue to inform and shape and compel even now. It is an act that requires rereading contemporary context in the presence of Yahweh, who is the subject of our imaginings." Brazilian educator Paulo Freire would argue that the role of the prophet is to educate for freedom and justice, to educate for conscientization. According to Freire, this critical consciousness involves an educational system in which people, especially those who have traditionally been at the margins of society, learn how to name and change the reality of poverty and oppression in their lives. Freire and Brueggemann agree on this, that in order to bring people to critical consciousness, an awareness of the wrongness of their world, the inadequacies of their social imaginary, it is necessary to engage in a dialogical process between the content of the curriculum and the context of the students. In this dialogue, which Freire calls reading the world and reading the word, the concrete historical, political, social, and religious context in which the learners are situated is taken as a profoundly important interpretive lens through which the content of the curriculum is viewed. In this dialogue, students come to see that the way things are is not necessarily the way things must be. And in this understanding is born the struggle for change and justice. Both Brueggemann and Freire are describing the prophetic imagination, the cultivation of an approach to the understanding the world that engages in a critique of the dominant consciousness and proposes a vision for a more just world. In many ways, seen through the lens of Freire's understanding of the educative potential of conscientization, Brueggemann's conception of the prophetic imagination becomes both a pedagogical approach and the content of liberative teaching. In other words, theological education calls on teachers to have a prophetic imagination and, in their work in the classroom, to cultivate a prophetic imagination in their students. As teachers in Catholic colleges, and as theological educators in particular, we need this prophetic imagination in order to bring the content of the curriculum that we're teaching, whatever branch of theology that might be, into conversation with the contexts of the students that we're teaching. Freire describes this as reading the word and reading the world. Villanova's Augustinian tradition describes this as faith-engaging culture. Brueggemann describes this as prophetic ministry. Teaching with a prophetic imagination means teaching with the intention to provoke students, to provoke them to consider the ways that our modern social imaginary is insufficient, and to provoke them to consider how an imagination based on God's reign provides hope for a better future. For some of our students, given their developmental capabilities or capacities, this may mean helping them to understand that there is a social imaginary that undergirds their experience of social reality, and that our faith tradition has a history of prophetic denunciation and enunciation. For other students, the practice of the prophetic imagination may also have the effect of cultivating in them their own prophetic imaginations. As they practice reading the world and reading the word, this becomes a more persistent part of their intellectual and spiritual repertoire. When we walk through the prophetic denunciation of the social imaginary and the prophetic enunciation of a better future, students can begin to take on this prophetic imagination. They begin to be transformed by what they are learning, and they can contribute to the ongoing conversation of how we might change our social imaginary and imagine a better future. Because my own scholarly interests are particularly, although not exclusively, in the concerns of young women, I want to look at this dynamic of the prophetic imagination from that perspective. In particular, the kinds of women that we are likely to engage in our theology classrooms and in our ministries with young women. And I want to do this for two reasons. First, because I believe that our contemporary society is a much more fraught place for young women than it is for young men, and that deserves special attention. And second, because I think that religious education that is liberative for young women will be liberative for everyone. In our contemporary world, a part of the social imaginary that needs to be taken seriously is the messages that are being received by young women. Psychologist Stephen Hinshaw describes what he sees in the social imaginary as a triple bind. Young women find themselves held to 3 sets of expectations that are contradictory and impossible to meet. First, young women are expected to be good at all of the traditionally feminine tasks, like friendships, relationship building, being nice, obedient, cooperative, helpful, and nurturing. They are expected to attract men and be a good girlfriend, while at the same time knowing how to manage their own sexual feelings and those of their boyfriends. Second, young women are expected to be good at all the things that had traditionally been the domain of men. They are expected to play sports, compete for leadership positions, seek and succeed at a competitive career. They are expected to approach dating in the ways that many men do, engaging in multiple brief and casual sexual encounters devoid of meaning and relationship. And finally, compounding these 2 competing expectations, young women are expected to do all of this while conforming to an unrealistic standard of what is expected for women's appearances. It is no longer enough for young women to be kind and nurturing, while at the same time being competitive and successful. They must also fit the ever narrower standards for looking pretty, hot, and model thin. One of the reasons that the triple bind is such a danger to young women is it has become embedded in the social imaginary of contemporary culture. It is largely unreflected upon, but it shapes the ways that girls and women understand themselves and their relationship to the world. And because it has become such a ubiquitous part of how people expect the world to be, it has become incredibly difficult to dislodge. And in fact, despite the best efforts of scholars, teachers, and activists to denounce it, the triple bind has proved remarkably resistant to reimagination. Resisting the triple bind, then, is not simply about recognizing it or denouncing it, or even, for young women, deciding to be a woman in a different way. Resisting means fighting one of the underlying assumptions of our culture, the assumption that governs the way that girls and women are to be in the world. I would suggest that when we are teaching with a prophetic imagination, and with an eye towards cultivating a prophetic imagination in our female students, this conversation between Brueggemann and Freire offers us a couple of strategies. First, we need to name, in the theological classroom, the ways in which the culture is harmful for young women. We can use the language of the triple bind or whatever language seems most appropriate, but we need to say out loud to young women that the way the social imaginary is shaping their existence of the world is, in fact, harmful for them. Second, we can explore with our female students the resources that already exist in our theological tradition that can help them to denounce this aspect of the social imaginary and announce a better way of being a woman in the world. The Bible's language of God's loving kindness and justice, the theological tradition's explorations of the Imago Dei symbol, the constructive proposals of feminist theologians, the examples of female saints, theologians, and church workers. All of these can provide us with ways to read the world and read the word with female students. Third, we can strategize with young women. Young women may know or sense that the social imaginary is doing harm to them, but without strategies to counter it, they can only feel powerless. Engaging young women in the imaginative exercise of thinking up ways to resist the triple bind not only offers them concrete options, but stokes their imaginations so that they can continue this beyond the classroom. And in strategizing, we also have the opportunity to help them practice these ways of resistance so that they can gain experience and confidence in the relatively safe space of our theological classrooms. And finally, and this really functions throughout all these other suggestions, we can persistently provoke their imaginations. We need not allow complacency, despair, and presumption to water down their imaginations. So in conclusion, bringing Taylor, Brueggemann, and Freire into conversation has, for me, made it clear how important it is that we engage students in this question of faith-engaging culture, especially in the theological classroom. While I've used the question of helping young women to resist the triple bind, I do think that this has much broader implications. And I mentioned it before, I think that it is clear from our just concluded elections that there's a great deal that's been revealed about our social imaginary and perhaps about our misunderstandings of our social imaginary. The prophetic action of denunciation and annunciation will be crucial as we think with our students about this. Ultimately, what I'm suggesting is not a new pedagogical technique, but rather an attitude or approach that can undergird whatever teaching techniques we might be using. It means taking seriously the contexts in which our students live and offering them a word from our theological tradition that can function prophetically. In this move, we move, as Tom Groom suggests, beyond the first tasks of informing and forming students to the responsibility to engage them in transformation, helping them to lay the foundation so that they can change their world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cindy.
Thank you.
And at this time, I'd like to open up the floor to any questions or comments for further conversation. Rachel?
So you sort of got at this when you turned to Freire, but one of the issues that I just feel like I'm always up against is that the image store, well, it's not empty. When we're talking about a theological tradition, these images, this storehouse of imagination that we have in the Bible has no residence for most of our students. And the images that are in the social, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about the reality TV imagination. I mean, the only reason Trump is even legible or possible is because of that imaginary, that reality TV imaginary. Somehow normal. So what do you do when that storehouse is empty? I mean, I get the idea of meeting them where they're at, but when...
And I do...
I feel like there's a gap.
Yes, absolutely. And obviously 20 minutes is not always sufficient. I do think there's an imaginative exercise that has to happen even before what I'm talking about. Because you're right, we need to kind of prime the pump or stock the stream or whatever metaphor you want to use, so that they have something to work with. I come from a long career of trying to hold up especially biblical images for kids. And I always find that reading especially the more difficult stories in the Bible for them is what really gets them engaged. Jesus is great for them, and they're happy to learn about Jesus. But if you can read Sodom and Gomorrah in a new way with them, or Jephthah's daughter in a new way, those are the stories that get them really thinking about kind of the gaps there. Does that kind of get at what you're asking?
So I mean, it just means our work is harder because
Oh, yeah.
we're walking in with, we don't have a shared language of, we can't assume the richness of that resonance.
Right.
It's really building a different imaginary from the ground up. Which,
Yeah.
it's just more difficult, I guess.
It is, and we're no longer in a place where we can assume that the majority of our students are coming to us with even basic knowledge about who Jesus is or what Christians believe, much less how Catholics put that into practice. So yes, I do think that the job is, it's a much steeper hill to climb, and in a shorter amount of time, because obviously, especially with the average undergraduate, you know, we see them, I think, what, in y'all's curriculum 3 times? You know, the
2 classes for undergrads.
2 classes for undergrads? Okay. You know, and it's hard to stoke that imagination in only 2 semesters. But just because something's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't give it a go. So, yes, sir.
So, first, Cynthia, I want to say, as the father of an adolescent daughter, I really appreciate what you said about the triple bind, and it was piercing my heart listening to you. So I think it's really important work.
Thank you.
The second piece is with regard to how we engage in prophetic teaching and prophetic language in the classroom within the structural confines that we face. And this is going on right here, right now, when we're being asked by the administration to confront the hatred and bigotry that's going on our campus. We were asked by our administration to do that. Well, as I think many of us would attest, when we teach in that prophetic way, in some ways, the structures of the neoliberal corporatized university penalize us. So there's the structural constraints. In addition to what Rachel mentioned, there's the structural constraints and challenges we face to operationalizing this. We can't assume, as I think you probably would know, that a Catholic university is going to be on board with this.
Right.
It's not.
Right.
Certainly the people in power, not all of them at least, are going to be on board with this. So how do we contend with that? And then a real practical issue, what do you do when students visibly, palpably, hostily react to this in the classroom?
Yeah, I think that's.
I'm hearing stories about that happening right now here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, you know, and that's, I think, the challenge of all ministry right now, not just teaching ministries. You know, and how do you walk that line between taking a prophetic stand in line with not only our religious tradition, but I would say in step with our current papacy, for the most part. And also not alienate the people that we need to draw further into that conversation. I'm teaching a first-year course now this semester, and you know, in the Thursday after the election, we were having this conversation as well. And you know, I have students in that classroom who are frightened, and I have students who feel victorious. And being attentive to that, I think requires even more imagination. On the one hand, we have a responsibility to do that in a way that is nurturing and careful so that we're not pushing people away. On the other hand, the examples from our tradition, both the biblical prophets and more modern day prophets, sometimes you have to take a stand, and sometimes that means taking a stand against the powers that be, both at the university level and at the archdiocesan and so on. And I don't say that in a kind of gung-ho idealistic sort of way. You know, there would be repercussions, of course. So balancing those things, you know, especially in a department of theology where we function as part of the church's teaching arm, you know. So all of those kind of competing pressures. I know I'm not actually answering your question, but it is something that I struggle with. Oh yeah.
I'm just wondering, in our culture of commodification, expediency and immediacy. How do you empower students to have an imagination at all before we get to the prophetic imagination? An imagination that anticipates a new future.
In my experience, a lot of it is kind of forcing them to slow down. And I know that that's hard, impossible to do when you only have a semester and you have 14 weeks and 26 classes or whatever it is. The unfortunate thing, of course, is that you can't just stand up in front of them and say, okay, now y'all need to grow yourself an imagination. Go, So how do we structure the questions that we ask, the assignments that we give them, the readings that they read, and how do we structure the pace of the classroom that gives them time to think more deeply about what they're learning, so they're not just taking information in, writing it down so that they can write an essay about it later. How do we slow that down a little bit so that they can think a little bit more creatively about it? I also think that the kinds of questions that we ask in our assessments can be real tools for that. How do we ask them to put what they're learning in the classroom in conversation with their career aspirations? How do we ask them to put the examples of the biblical prophets that they might be learning about into conversation with current events? And I think that we can use assessment as a way of priming the pump that way, because they have to do it. If we assign the essay, they're going to do it. So, does that kind of get at what you're hoping or thinking about?
Thank you for your presentation. What you talked about seems as if a prophetic imagination in theology classes is kind of counterposed to the social imaginary out there, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see any resources in that social imaginary that you can draw on? Or is what we are doing a complete, turnaround and scratch everything and start all over again?
No. And I focused on the potential negative side of what's going on in our social imaginary, and you all have named some of those, consumerism, kind of fast-paced society, the triple bind, all these kinds of things. But I do think that there's important value in recognizing what's good there, and carrying that forward. And I think that that's also in line with what the prophets were doing, that they were, they're taking these symbols of the tradition and saying, this spoke to us at one time and it can speak to us again. And I think that that's also a really important part of what we need to do, because you can't build a positive vision solely on critique. I think that then you run the risk of being dismissed as being just too critical, that everything is bad in the world and the church is all good and it's all rosy over here and it's all bad over there, and that's getting us into a kind of us-them dynamic that's not helpful. Does that kind of get at what you were hoping for?
Kevin and then Carrie.
Thanks for this, and I have 3 daughters too, so I think you spoke to this a little bit at the beginning, but I wanted to ask you, with this slide that you have up in mind in particular, is there a sort of theological logic that sort of runs through all 4 steps? In other words, is there a sort of theological rationale that informs the whole way of thinking about it? Because, on the face of it, this last slide, you could take out theological and put in literary and say, well, so in step 2, we're going to read literary resources. And,
Sure.
And so is the theology sort of something other than a resource for a pedagogy that's already been established in other ways? Or, maybe, I guess what I'm asking is, can you bring the Brueggemann prophetic critique, sort of perspective sort of thread that through how the whole process is that. Does that make sense as a question?
I think so.
Okay.
I'll say some things, and then maybe you can. I appreciate your question. I think that you're right that any classroom in a Catholic university, this would hopefully be going on in the English classroom, history classroom, nursing classroom, all of these things. For me, this particular process or strategy is actually a theological method for me. For me, it's a practical theology method. And I think that, for me, that's the theological undergirding for what I'm thinking about, is really more of a methodological question than a content question. Having said that, I think that all of this has to be grounded, especially the critique that I'm offering of the triple bind, has to be grounded in a very careful articulation of a theological anthropology that's robust enough to sustain it. I think that without a theological anthropology that is absolutely convinced and convincing of the goodness of women and girls, these kinds of strategies are going to fall apart. So, okay.
I was going to say, that plus something like a theology of culture would help you get at sort of Stephanie's question in a way too, right?
Yeah.
That how do you sort out the, what can be affirmed from what needs to be critiqued, and well, you need to have some way of sort of framing that kind of question.
Right.
So,
Good. Thank you.
appreciate that.
I appreciated your talk very much.
Thank you.
You made me think about several things on the social imaginary. First of all, naming it.
Mm-hmm.
They don't even know they're in it. But also, we don't know we're in it. Like when I was listening to Ilya talk about commodification and all these terms I know, postmodern, and just making that connection. We're both swirled up in different microcultures, and we think we're communicating, but the fragility of comprehension on both sides seems to be getting more real every year to me.
Well, and yes, I'm sorry.
No, I bailed on the Bible, and it's my area. So instead of talking about a prophet in the Old Testament, a prostitute in the Old Testament, I use one out of a rap song that they all know better than I do, and they all know the lingo better than I do, and it's a micro critique against the exploitation of women in Keisha's song, or there are a bunch of things that I use that I let the students educate me on what's that slang for, and this. But you see rap in the last years turning into its own critique of the imaginary it's created, and then it breaks my heart. I can't start with the Bible, but I sneak them back there. This is what Ezekiel is doing.
And I think that ultimately that's the way that we're going to be stoking their imaginations, is by starting with what they already know, like the song from Keisha, or
Is that what you meant with you listen attentively to what they're? Because I don't even know what.
Yeah, and I think that yes, we want to listen attentively to the worlds that they're living in, but I also think that we don't need to do all that. I'm going to reveal my age here. We don't need to be watching MTV, and listening to the music. We can get them to tell us what it is. Then we can help them see the holes, and then we can say, hey, how about Ezekiel? But if we do it right, maybe it's not,
This is a real life perspective.
I know. This is all very idealistic.
It's great.
It's all very idealistic, I know, yeah.
Ezekiel a rapper.
Ooh. Would Ezekiel have been a rapper? That's a question.
Yeah.
There you go. Jonathan?
This is a very basic question, I think, but when I have to also join the chorus, I have a daughter, so this resonates with me quite profoundly as well. But going back to the triple bind, have brought aspects of that up in discussions with
Mhm.
students before. And something I've encountered that it took me a while to sort of sort out myself, because I think for me, the problem with that seems, it's obvious, right? This is not sustainable as sort of a psychologist, right? But something I've run into, and here at Villanova, not universally, but occasionally, is that sometimes when you're talking up to the young women, right, by definition, they see themselves as having already successfully negotiated the triple bond,
Right.
So they, whether you want to use the language of they see themselves as the winners, right? And so you almost, when you broach even one aspect of that triple bind, sometimes you get a little bit of resistance, because they're like, but wait, I've already played the game and I'm winning.
Right.
Right? And so why would I want to give up this game when I'm already close to the top, right? Does that make
Right,
sense?
yeah.
And I guess what I'm getting at is, other than pointing out the obvious, that by the time you're 40, this is going to be very destructive. What sort of effective moves have you made, especially with the younger women who are either are winning or are on their way to perceiving themselves as winners in this very horrible game? What do you say?
I think there's two things that are springing to my mind immediately, maybe more as I talk. The first is that one of the things I didn't talk about that Hinshaw really explores in a very helpful way is the way in which perfectionism is wrapped up into the triple bind. That it's not just that they're held to these three standards, but they have to be perfect at all three of them. And so girls can get wrapped up into this hyper anxiety about how they are not only kind of professionally, whatever that means, but also socially. That they have to have the perfect major, get all the A's, write all the perfect term papers. Teachers should love them as the most brilliant student ever. And they have to have the perfect boyfriend, not an inadequate boyfriend, a socially inadequate boyfriend. They should be sexually active just enough, but not too much, because you don't want to fall into the slut shaming thing, And so it's even when they feel like they are moving forward in these categories, this perfectionism is always making them doubt themselves, that they're not successful enough, that they might have gotten into Villanova, but are they going to get into a good graduate school? They might have decided that they want to be a nurse, but everybody keeps asking them why don't they want to be a doctor. They might, and on the relationship front, they might have had a successful relationship in high school, but now they're in a new community and they haven't met anybody, and all the men that they meet are just pressuring them to have sex. And how do they manage these things? And so even when they're presenting this front of confidence, I've mastered this. I negotiated high school and I got into a good college. I won the game. The voices in their head that's not what's going on in their heads. They're still feeling all of these conflicting things. And the increase that we see in self-harming and behaviors in college, the increase that we see in eating disorders in college among young women, that's where it gets played out, that I'm not coping and I need to do something to help me cope. And for a lot of them, it's restricting eating or exercising way too much. So
That's really hidden from us.
it's so hard to see. And girls who are engaging in these things are so good at hiding it. But it's the girl who's always wearing long sleeves.
They must be exhausted on the inside.
It's exhausting just thinking about it. Yeah. I had something else to say, but I can't remember what it is now.
We're
out of time? Okay.
Unfortunately, yeah. Cindy has a lunch for graduate students and a few other appointments this afternoon.
Yes.
But let's thank her for her time.
Thank you.